It's Matt and Dave with DSX Tuning. We are back again to do a bit of a deep dive on the Atlas port controller. I think we're going to be covering the controller operation, what makes it work, why is it special, really just what makes it such a great piece of equipment. So I think that's kind of where we'll start. I mean, the Atlas port controller, very robust piece of hardware. Tell us about how it works.
The first thing I think everybody notices is there's nowhere to plug in a USB cable or something. And
pretty
that's
nice.
because this operates completely on Wi-Fi. So on the board, there's two separate chips. There's an ESP32 that handles the user interface, that handles all the handshake stuff on the HP Tuner side, that handles reflashing everything. And then there is an STM32, which does all the heavy lifting of the actual fuel control, engine timing, things like that. Just talking about engine timing, that thing's been tested up to 15,000 RPM, and it still keeps up just fine. It's got the bandwidth to do that, which is super cool. But going back to the access to the unit and talking about Wi-Fi, so what you do is you key your car on, don't start it. You can push the brake pedal pretty hard and hit cruise down, or you can hold the gas pedal down for 2 seconds. If the car's running, the gas pedal thing doesn't work. We don't want people ripping off the rev limiter to turn their Wi-Fi on. So you got to do the brake pedal cruise button thing. And if you go look at your Wi-Fi networks, you'll see one pop up called DSX Atlas Wi-Fi. Connect to it. It will automatically bring up a browser. Please don't use Microsoft Edge. It will not work.
Nobody's using Microsoft Edge.
Well, you never know. Chrome, Firefox, those are what you really need to use. You can use your cell phone if you want. It works on these two. It works in Safari.
Not optimized for mobile.
It is not optimized for mobile at all. You will be doing a lot of squint and pinch. Anyway, it'll bring up a web page. You click login, and it's going to take you to the main page. And from there, you're going to be able to see live data that's being reported from the port controller, kind of some information about what's going on. If you go to the Setup tab, you can see what version everything's running on. That's where you can do all the firmware updates. There's the UI that you can update, but it defaults to what we call the FCU, the fuel control unit. That's that STM32 chip. Like I said, you upload everything through there. We've got a lot of options that are not available in the UI that you can edit in Tuner Pro. That really covers more of the boost control stuff. The core things that you need to do, you can do it all through the web page. So if going back to that main page, there's a drop-down menu. Just pick your injectors, hit commit, it'll reflash, you're good to go. You really don't need to mess with anything.
And that's also, this same interface that you're talking about is how we'll update for future add-ons.
Yep.
Boost control, pump control, etc. So you don't have to send this thing back into us or anything like that.
Well, there is one use case when we eventually release the onboard widebands.
Okay, sure.
If you're not already using the CAN widebands and we release this onboard control thing, you will have to send it back because that requires a board level update. There's no way around that. Once we release that function, everything that ships out will already be programmed for it. You'll be fine. So that's really only going to apply to the small number of people who buy it with no widebands right now. They're not using the CAN setup, but they want to add it later.
Covering basically the entry port. When you get the unit and you go to set it up, we've kind of covered that to an extent. The Atlas port controller, obviously, a lot of functionality. The data that you're seeing in the unit, is that the same data that is being displayed in HP tuners with it being a supported module, or is that different?
Yes, so everything that you can see in HP tuners, you can see in the web UI. It's the same data set.
Okay.
Obviously, it's not ideal to sit there and look at a web page while you're doing a dyno pull or something. So logging in HP tuners is the preferred method. But if you just want to check something real quick, that's a great way.
Sure,
to do it.
You can do it on your phone while you're driving down the road or whatever the case might be if you don't have your laptop.
And of note, just for everybody that's curious, when these ship out the door, they ship already programmed for LS3 injectors. If you want us to do it ahead of time, we can update them to whatever you want. So you can literally receive this thing and plug it in and just be on your way.
Yep.
Just let us know. We're happy to do it.
Yeah, it is an option. If you put it in your order notes, we can do that. Obviously, we will touch on the equipment side of it probably a little bit further into the video, talking about the injectors we're using and what's supported. Obviously, there is a space to use other injectors where you're providing data, but something we can touch on in a bit. Speaking about the controller itself, its communication, I know we talked about in the first video, that's basically the intro to all of these other videos, is what a robust piece of equipment the Atlas port controller is, how it's communicating, the rate at which it's communicating. Do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, so this kind of goes back to the patch that we developed. We're running this thing at 160 hertz on the data input. We don't have to send anything back. This thing is smart enough to digest the information it receives, make all of its decisions, and just be done with it. And it's super simple. And I know everybody wants to know, well, what exactly is it doing? Well, we're not going to tell you that because that's part of the competitive advantage. But my best suggestion is talk to people that have used it. Ask them, does it work? Does it actually do what they say it does? And they will tell you yes. It just works.
In terms of the data that we're receiving from the factory ECU, how does that impact the overall operation? What is this thing able to do where it's, as far as any kind of cylinder events, what exactly, the data that we're receiving, how are we using it?
So because we're not tying into sensors and trying to decipher them, we're getting actual results out of the ECU. We can do a couple of things that nobody else can do. The overarching concept here is the automated makeup of fuel, where it just it fills in the gap for you. But because we know what's happening, we know how much fuel the factory ECU is actually providing through the DI system, we know how much is needed in total, we can automatically calculate what your port fraction is. And I say port fraction, it should actually be airflow fraction, because that's how we treat it. We look at what portion of the air charge is being fueled by the DI system and what's left. With that, we use that for what we call a PE adder table. If you're running pure DI on a boosted car, you might run at 0.85 lambda, and that's just kind of this magic number that everybody has landed on. If you're running a port-injected car, so no DI, you're pure port, you're probably closer to like 0.78, because port-injected fuel does not mix as well. Well, what if you're running a blend? Where the hell are you supposed to end up? Well, that's why we split this into, this is the air charge fueled by the DI system, this is the air charge being fueled by the port system. And we've got this blend table that allows you to command a richer mixture that's totally dynamic. It's totally based on how much port fuel you're spraying. So let's say you're doing a dyno pull and you're looking in HP tuners, and you can watch as your RPM's going up, you can watch your port fraction increasing. And we send out a new value that we call new EQ ratio. So we take the ECU's target and we add to it with the SATR table. We send that back out. So that's what is actually being targeted overall. And if you follow that,
you can watch all that live.
You can watch all that live, and you'll see that, as your port fraction is going up, it's kind of commanding a richer mixture. Now, if you want to do away with that, you can zero that table out. That's in the main UI. Like you can do that from the web page. You don't have to do anything special. So if you don't like that, shut it down. But I would highly suggest that you take advantage of that, because you've got a very dynamic system. Let's say you're on pump gas. You're maxing out at like 0.2, 20% on port contribution, but now you're on ethanol, and now 60% of your fuel is coming from ethanol. You're going to need very different operating conditions to meet that, and that's where this dynamic makeup comes into play.
Some people will probably understand what you said, some might not. Maybe it's not important to you at all, but I think really, what is it doing? How is it operating in layman's terms? For the average end user that it might buy this through a vendor, get it installed on their car and tuned, and be done with it. They might not ever have to touch that. And then from there, I think one of the talking points we wanted to have was how the factory ECU is handling cylinder events, and how the Atlas port controller handles cylinder events.
The most boiled down explanation of how this thing works is we know total airflow. We know how much fuel the DI system is providing because we've done a ton of math that's super robust, and we have access to information that nobody does. And we know how much more fuel needs to be added to meet that overall target. And we just achieve that. We do that through using basic physics. We characterize the injectors that are being used. We monitor fuel pressure. We know exactly what's happening at any given time. And we follow some, honestly, pretty simple math to get there.
Sure.
Now, you have some weird scenarios like you talked about, like fuel cut. Everybody's used to just global fuel cut. And that's cool and all, but that's not what these things do. An E92, when it determines that it needs to control the speed of the engine, if it really needs to get aggressive, let's say on a shift, you might cut all 8 cylinders, shifting from first to second.
Sure.
That's pretty easy to handle. But there are times where you're sitting on the rev limiter and the ECU might determine, you know what, I don't need to cut all 8 because that's too harsh. I'm going to cut 4 of them, but I'm going to do it at random. Or I'm going to cut 2 of them. Or I'm going to cut just 1, but I'm going to keep that cylinder off for 20 rotations. Well, how do you process that? If you've got, let's get real basic and talk about a meth kit, and you hit the limiter,
Yeah.
it's not going to survive that.
Sure.
For a sustained period of time. If you've got some other port system that can't see this information and it's just, another system working in tandem loosely, it's not going to see that. Now, for us, when you trigger an individual cylinder to be cut, well, I say when the ECU triggers one cylinder to be cut, we can see that. We're updating at 160 hertz. We're getting pretty fast refresh rates on all this stuff.
So how does the Atlas handle that part?
We shut that cylinder down. But we only shut that cylinder down. Now, you might get one engine cycle where you've got a goofy mixture, and even on a ZR1, that happens. Just there is a time component that is unavoidable. It's how it goes. But they passed emissions, they passed durability. Clearly, it's not an issue. We just abide by the same rules. So if you're cutting just 2, we'll cut those 2, and we'll let the other 6 go. And we do all of that in real time. We're constantly watching and constantly adjusting.
Sure.
Just to keep up with what's going on the factory side.
So back to the Atlas port controller and how it is communicating. We're receiving data from the factory ECM. Tell me more about how that portion of it's working. We're teed into everything that we need. Mm-hmm. We are receiving data, but we are not sending anything out. We don't have to do that.
No, there's just no need. The algorithm is robust enough that we don't need to try and modify anything that the factory ECU is doing. We know how to get to a point where it's going to essentially freeze operation, for lack of a better word, and then we're just going to take over. We tie into 2 CAN buses instead of just 1. We tie into the main vehicle CAN just because there's a lot of low priority stuff that already exists there, and we grab that for some, again, lower priority functions. All of the critical stuff is happening on this other bus. So in factory form, this bus is at 3% total usage. Some applications don't even use it, like some Camaros, where they don't use a factory fuel pump power module. They don't even use that bus.
Sure.
On those, we turn that one on, we tie into it. When we're done with it, especially if you've got like the wide bands, you can watch that bus usage is now 40, 50%.
Sure.
So we're absolutely hammering this thing with data coming out. We send information for HP tuners on the main bus. The 2 chips that are on that board, the ESP and the STM, they actually communicate with each other over that same CAN bus. So for somebody out there trying to monitor some CAN traffic and stuff, you might see chatter between those 2 things. That's what it is. There's requests that the ESP will send to the STM and vice versa. And it's already there. Why not use it? Now you don't have to monitor yet another data bus because that STM is doing a lot of time critical stuff.
Yeah, and we don't have risk with the buses that are being used and what they're being used for of crashing anything or overloading it and slowing things down. Really just intelligent design.
Yeah. I mean, it's very purpose-built. This is the result of, not to toot my own horn, but somebody who fully understood the architecture of the starting system and what could be manipulated and how it could be manipulated without detriment.
Sure. Can you shed some light? I know there are tuners that will likely watch this. I think a big talking point for some of them is a lot of these guys are already what would be considered port control experts. What does the Atlas port controller mean for them?
I mean, it just means they're going to save time. I don't know why anybody would hate on that.
Sure.
Maybe some people out there are going to be offended by it because it unshrouds this mystery that has existed with how do you get a car to not self-destruct on port injection. I mean, it does it for you.
Sure.
But the cool thing is that the way this functions and the way that, everything just seamlessly kind of comes in, it's still robust enough to work for people that are doing 12, 13, 1400 horsepower, seasoned veterans, professionals. We've had people that are big names in the industry use this thing.
Of course.
And they all say the same thing. Like, this is ridiculous. Like, I don't have to mess with it. And for them, that time saving is huge because now they're not fiddling with this and trying to monkey this and moving all this stuff back to where it needs to go. And a lot of that circles around the fact that we don't break the factory torque model. Like, you can watch in your scanner and you can see, airflow is still going, cylinder mass is still going, torque is still going. Like, I'm not artificially clipping all this crap or trying to move it back up. Your automatic transmission will thank you.
I think that makes a lot of sense.
Manual guys, maybe you don't really give a damn, but unless you still want rev matching.
So if we want to touch on the opposite end of that spectrum, for the end user, the customer is going to the website, they're going to a vendor, they're buying the Atlas port controller, shipping to their house, they're going to install this unit at home and take it to the tuner. Mm-hmm. What does that look like?
I mean, it's pretty simple. You're going to pin the ECU, and then it's just plug and play from there. There is not much to it. What I would suggest is to not install this on your car and take it to your tuner and do nothing. If you're going to do that, pull the fuse out of it, just because your file hasn't been patched yet. So when you buy these, you have to send us your HP tuners file. I'll apply a patch to it. I will send it back. You do a right entire. When the right entire is done, you just read your file back out of the ECU because the serial number that's in the file I send you is going to be wacky because it's a special version of this operating system. So to restore everything, you got to read it back out once you apply the patch. But I mean, it's super simple, and if you can follow basic instructions, you can have this running without a problem.
And to tuners or self-tuners or whomever is going to be using the Atlas port controller, if you're worried about intellectual property or tune or this or that or the other thing, if there's any specific reason you don't want us to have that file, you can send us.
Yeah, you can send me a stock file. I don't give a damn about what you do, though.
Totally.
Honestly, nothing is going to surprise me, or nobody's going to show me something that I didn't know.
Fair. It's been a hot topic for some people. I know it's been mentioned numerous times is, hey, why do I have to send my file? Yeah. You don't have to send your tune file. You can send a factory file, we'll update it, and you can copy your changes over.
Right. The big thing that I would suggest is to send me an actual file from that car, though. Don't send me some crap from something else. The reason I say that is I have to copy all of the segments over from the file you send me. Just some stuff has to match. But if you want to protect what you're doing, that's fine. Just send me a stock file from that vehicle. Or you can zero every table out. I don't care.
Fair enough. So if you're worried about that portion of it, you're covered.
Yeah, no big deal.
Next thing on my talking list was injection timing. How are we handling that? What's the control strategy maybe that you recommend, or what are we doing with that? Tell us a little bit about it.
So the core feature that this centers around, I mean, there's multiple facets to what needs to happen for this, but one of the core ones is there's a value that dictates the maximum on time of a direct injector from the factory. It's set to 350 degrees, and everybody's like, well, what's 350 degrees? Well, let's back up. One full cycle of the engine is 720 degrees, okay? So 350 degrees is about 47% of that. So if you've ever seen your injectors max out at 40% or 47% duty cycle, that's where that comes into play. What we do is we shrink that down to 180 degrees. Now, we don't lock you into this. You can set this to whatever you want. If you want to run it at 120, 150, 220, I don't care. Just 180 is a good starting point that's at the center of the bell curve in terms of what's going to accommodate almost everybody. That's it. That's the only thing that changes. That's your driving factor for tuning this thing. So you want more port, lower that number. You want to stretch the DI system out, I wouldn't suggest it. Raise that number.
So when we're talking about this as far as being data-driven, equipment is very important. And I think you touch on this on basically everything every tech blog you have, in most content that you create where we're talking about products, we're talking about, hey, we need good data. Can you touch on why we're doing what we're doing and what we're recommending for the end user to have as far as, it's not just your port injectors that we need to have impeccable data. It's also the direct injection system. I mean, they play equal parts. You want to touch on that?
Yeah, so Mitch McKee has a T-shirt with a saying that I really love.
I have several of those.
Yeah, it says, in God we trust, all others need data. And like, it's funny, but it's true. Like, data is king. You know, that there's no room for opinions when you're trying to make calculations in real time that will decide whether or not your engine develops a window. So we need to be mindful of that. I mean, the accurate data is important for anything. You know, you're not going to just put mystery stuff in and think you can hit go and be on your way. So, yeah, I mean, we harp on data on the port injection side, and we try to steer people into things that have known good data. Those are three very important words. The DI side totally matters too, though.
Sure.
I'm not personally convinced that any of these aftermarket DI injectors have data that's actually true. If somebody wants to show me their lab-obtained empirical flow data and how they determined everything, how they determined their offsets and their flow rates, I am more than happy to give an honest, unbiased review because I understand how to go from your flow bench data to what gets entered into the ECU.
Sure.
But to date, I'm just going to tell everybody is just run factory LT4 injectors. You know, run an LT4 high side pump, and you know you can run a cam and overdrive it, and like that's fine.
The cams aren't a problem because the fuel lobe is a staple for most of those. But I think right now, as far as operation is concerned, the recommendation would be factory high side stuff, preferably LT4 stuff. There are people running it on LT1 stuff, with ID 1050s in the port and having success. The DI side of things, it is best for just a clean slate. So if you're trying to make 1,400 horsepower, don't think that in addition to the port control, in addition to the Atlas port controller and its hardware, that you also need to upgrade your DI stuff. If you've already done that, maybe you can recoup some money pulling that off and selling it secondhand to somebody that isn't prepared to report.
Or you can leave it on. I mean, there's no doubt that more DI is going to create more power within reason. Like, there's an asterisk to that, and it has to do with timing everything correctly in the right window, which I don't, for whatever reason, people don't want to adhere to that. But, I mean, the reality is that if you're injecting the fuel in the cylinder, you're not taking up space of air in the intake runner. That is immutable.
Okay, sure.
So, like, we get it, but again, you want something with good data, and when you're talking, maybe 20 horsepower on a 1,200 horsepower car, like, do you really care? Probably not.
I don't find that to be a concern. But
I mean, that's variance from pull to pull.
We've talked about setup and general operation. We've touched on the patch and the data being sent to the Atlas port controller. We've touched on cylinder events, fuel cut, how it's handling that. We've touched on, and briefly touched on injection timing. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that a little more.
We'll do that separate.
And then equipment-wise, we've briefly touched on, hey, you can use it with any DI setup you want. Factory stuff's working great. OE or ID, your dealer's choice there for your port injectors. If you are converting over from another port injection system, we are using 34 millimeter injectors in our port. If you don't have IDs for the plates that take the longer injectors, ID sells the spacers and stuff to make that work. So you would have to, convert over if you didn't have injector dynamics. That way, is there anything you want to touch on there? If you're converting from another system to the Atlas port controller,
I start over from a stock tune.
well, yeah, I mean, I think that's a big portion of it. So we touched on that. We touched on equipment. Is there anything else you want to cover as far as the controller, general operation?
Yeah, I think going back, maybe it is a good time to talk about injection timing in a little more detail, because there is a world of confusion here, and there should not be. And it's really not that hard, and I don't know why it's been shrouded in mystery for so long, and why people want to keep it like it's this dark secret, or they have this, super duper extra knowledge about what it is, and this, that, whatever. So let's back up. The piston being at the top of travel between compression and power, that's 0 degrees in terms of...
We're talking about just crank rotation.
Yep, everything is a function of crank rotation when it comes to DI. The DI scheduling in the code is done based off of crank position. It's not time or any of this other goofy stuff everybody wants to bring into the conversation. It is all based off of crankshaft position. It's like paramount. That's the cornerstone. That's the bottom of the pyramid, so to say. So 0 degrees, that's compression transitioning into power. Everybody knows spark timing is 20 degrees before top dead center. Okay, cool. So let's talk about your compression stroke. Your compression stroke is from the bottom of piston travel to the top. Well, that's 180 degrees before top dead center to 0. Compression seems like a real bad time to spray fuel. Anybody that's messed around with DI knows that if you're trying to shoot fuel in against a piston that is compressing everything in there, well, now you're building up a ton of pressure that's going to fight your DI injector. It's going to damage it potentially. Your fuel is not going to atomize properly. It's going to run like crap. All right, so back up. And if you look at factory timing events for fuel injection, you'll see that they're actually spraying during the intake stroke. In a factory start of injection table, they never go above like 360. There are instances where you're in like 370, 380 range. A lot of it has to do with whether or not your cam's been advanced. All of those come into play. There's things like catalyst light off, engine coolant temperature, all of things like that affect when this is happening. But we're not necessarily concerned with these shorter events, which are hypersensitive. When you're talking an injection duration less than 5 degrees, they're really sensitive to when they happen.
Sure.
We want to talk about the longer pulses. So back up a little more. 360 degrees, what does that look like? Well, that's the transition from exhaust, you're at the top of the travel, to intake. So your usable window is essentially from the end of the exhaust stroke to the end of the intake stroke. Well, that's 180 degrees. Oh, we know that number. That's the cornerstone of what this thing functions on, with having to limit the DI system.
Sure, yeah.
Going wider than that means you have to spread into other areas that you don't want to do. You can either delay the end of injection, EOI. If you bleed past 180, well, now you're in the compression stroke. That's bad news bears. You can advance it into the exhaust stroke, but now you're effectively spraying fuel into air that's being actively pushed out of the cylinder. That's kind of a dumb choice to do as well.
Yeah.
So what do you want to do? Use the intake stroke. It's cam events come into play, and again, this is where tweaks to that max duration will matter. But
which is all adjustable.
All adjustable. By and large, you're going to be at 180 degrees. You want your start of injection at 360. You want your end of injection at 180. Maybe you advance that a little bit. The thing I kind of tell everybody is really look at your center of injection. that's a really easy thing to calculate too. It's the average of your SOI and your EOI. And if you look, that's going to fall like about 270 degrees, so maybe be a little ahead of that. So that means you want the center of your shot happening when your piston is halfway through travel.
And center of injection is displayed in the scanner, or you've showed that.
You have to create your own parameter for it.
Defined. Sure.
The way that GM handles injection timing, it's all based off of duration. And the way that they do that, they go through all of this crap. They calculate how much fuel you want to inject. They turn that into a crank duration. They say this is how much movement the crank has to make this pulse. And then they say, okay, well, when do I want to start it? So end of injection is a resultant variable. That is the end of your equation. You can't dictate that. So you have to correct everything through SOI. Going back to the center of injection topic, if you've got something that is less than the duration of your intake stroke, you essentially want to time that so your center of injection is before the middle of your piston movement. If you watch a factory file and you watch this center of injection value, you can see that they're essentially always keeping it a little ahead of the middle of travel. Now, again, when your pulse is really long, that doesn't really matter. But everybody wants to also talk about, well, I know that 5 milliseconds is how long my DI injector is supposed to be on, and this doesn't let me adjust for lower RPM. Well, why is that number important?
Why is that number important?
I don't think people even know where it comes from. If you look at 6,000 RPM, which is kind of in the meat of where you're operating while you're racing your car,
sure,
180 degrees worth of crank rotation is 5 milliseconds. Well, okay, I want to use that everywhere. Well, why? At 4,000 RPM, that's a different value. At 3,000 RPM, 5 milliseconds is only 90 degrees worth of crank movement. And if you start playing with this stuff and you stretch out your DI pulse down low, you'll find that you'll pick up more power. So everybody starts to freak out, at 3,000 RPM and 180 degrees of duration, I'm at a 10 millisecond pulse. Well, so what? You're still spraying in that intake stroke.
Sure.
So, go back and let's add port injection to the mix down there. Okay, so you've shortened your DI pulse at low RPM, and now you're just puking a big mass of fuel in through the intake valve when it opens. That's all port does. That fuel just waits on the other side of the intake valve and then craps into the system as soon as that thing opens. That's historically how it's always been. Why is that better than a full-length pulse where you're not taking the position of air? Like, you're not displacing air coming into the cylinder. You will make more power stretching that out down low. So, take it all the way back. That 180-degree limiter where you're just limiting against the intake stroke, like, that's where this thing shines. You are always going to exercise the DI system to the greatest of its capability, which means you're going to get the most benefit out of it.
Talking about the Atlas Port Controller's operation, why is it doing it so much better? The algorithm doing what it's doing, and you having all of the control that you really need, we don't need to worry about the milliseconds. We're operating just on crank rotation.
Yep.
There's a nice article on the website if you like to read and you like memes. I think the most recent tech blog gives a nice explanation of this.
Yep.
If you prefer to read information rather than watch it or listen to it. What makes this methodology better than what others are doing?
It's simple and repeatable. And it goes back to letting the DI system flex as far as it can before you start to make up the difference.
So we're using the optimal amount of DI at any given time.
At any given time.
And you're letting the Atlas Port Controller make up the rest.
Yep. And, everybody wants to talk about fraction and this and that. Like, you don't need to define that. It just needs to be a result of your system. Defining it ahead of time, it's just not important. And everybody that uses this with an unbiased view realizes, oh, yeah, like this works great. This is awesome.
So we've covered a lot of topics. I think the injection timing thing can likely be expanded on in another video. If you choose, we could do some visuals and things like that to better explain what happens there. Anything else you want to cover on the basic operation? We've covered the equipment, cylinder events, the way it communicates or is communicated with. Anything else you want to touch on?
I think another point to talk about is DI pressure. People have concerns about, if I run this at 180 degrees, well, my DI pressure sinks at low RPM. About 3,000 RPM, 3 to 4 is where your DI pump is probably going to have the hardest time.
And why is that happening?
That's the greatest volume demand on that pump. You got to figure that's a positive displacement pump, so it's going to move more raw volume the faster you spin it. But at lower RPM with a positive displacement blower, you have a huge cylinder air mass that you're trying to meet the needs of, and it's just a taxing point. Like the flow of the DI pump is not up to the task, so your pressure starts to fall. Now, as pressure goes down, your flow goes up within reason. Well, we did our own testing to validate whether or not this really matters, because when we first started using this port injection system on our test car is ported, stock blower, 2.3 upper, big gulp intake, headers. It's got our Camaro in-tank bucket. We're running on E70 and port injection with all 3 injectors. Stock cam, stock LT4, high side, everything. And it would not survive at this power level. I mean, it makes about 740 wheel horsepower just on repeat for the most part. That DI system wasn't going to keep up.
Sure.
Well, what we saw in the dyno graph just before we even started playing with injection timing was this dip in power that would recover by about 4,800 RPM and super repeatable, and dug into it a little and started watching, start of injection, end of injection, center of injection, all this stuff. It's like, oh, we're taxing this system much further than the factory ever intended, and now we're bleeding into the compression stroke. Our injection timing is happening during compression, and that's bad. So we thought, okay, well, we're going to run more port fuel. We're going to lower that 180 value down to 120 so this thing can recover. We did that, and it wasn't losing DI pressure anymore, and we picked up like 30 horsepower. Cool. And this whole thing is talked about in that article that Matt mentioned. And then I thought, all right, well, let's go back the other way. Let's set this back to 180. Let's just let DI pressure fall. It falls down to, I think, about 11 or 12 MPa. But let's fix the injection timing so we stay in that intake stroke. And we did that. Well, now we picked up 40 horsepower. So now we're making more power with no port fuel and lower DI pressure than we did with full DI pressure, a shorter DI pulse, and some port helping out. And I mean, I would say that's pretty compelling to establish that either, the pressure drop doesn't really matter or it's actually better. Because the reality is a long pulse at lower pressure is getting you more fuel into the cylinder directly in as compared to full pressure with a shorter pulse and making up the difference with port. I would strongly urge people to try this for themselves and give it a fair shake without trying to manipulate data, and realize that that's a reality, that you don't really need to stress over the DI pressure falling. Change your command so that you are commanding less pressure, and fix your pump calibration table. Nobody does that. I guess nobody knows how, but nobody does that.
So we've covered a lot. There will probably be questions, and we're going to do our best to answer those questions as they're received, be that by email, comments, etc. If there's nothing else you want to touch on this one, I think we'll wrap this one up. If you want to expand further on any of that stuff, I think we have a couple more modules coming up where we'll cover a couple of these pieces based on some of the auxiliary equipment that makes sense with. But Dave at DSXtuning.com, Matt at DSXtuning.com. If you have any questions, obviously feel free to reach out. Otherwise, we'll do our best to police the comments and whatnot so we can get your questions answered.